Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second webinar in our four-part Foodborne Pathogen webinar series, Seafood Pathogens of Concern in Retail Establishments. My name is Laura Wilde, and I'm the Senior Program Analyst in Food Safety with the National Environmental Health Association. It is my pleasure to facilitate today's webinar. I'm joined by my colleagues, Maddie Gustafson, Project Coordinator, and Taryn Laird, Public Health Communications Specialist. Please note, this webinar is being recorded. If you are not okay with this being recorded, you may disconnect at this time. We are now in our second week of National Food Safety Education Month. NEHA is dedicated to supporting our food safety workforce and continue to offer several free events and webinars throughout September. Take a look at our website for more information. We want to honor our essential workers by highlighting some of the great work accomplished by you, our food safety professionals. Submit your food safety hero to be recognized for their hard work and dedication to their profession on our website. Additionally, membership does have its benefits. We create and deliver value every day for you. Connect with your peers, network, and get access to valuable resources and educational materials. If you're not already a member of NEHA, check out our website at neha.org to learn more. A bit of housekeeping before we dive into seafood pathogens. All attendees are in listen-only mode, and as a reminder, this webinar is being recorded. We intend to have time for questions at the end of the presentations, so please submit any questions you may have in the Q&A box, and we will do our best to answer as many questions as time permits. I'm pleased to introduce our speaker today, Eugene E. Evans. Eugene Evans is a supervising food inspector with New York State Department of Agriculture and Markets, where he has been employed for 19 years. Eugene is an IFPTI Fellow, Cohort 4, with a published fellowship project, Surface Pathogen Elimination Practices for Ready-to-Eat Fishery Products. Eugene is an active member of AFTO, AFDOS, CASA, IAFI, and the Vice President of CASA New York Chapter. As a longtime member of the AFTO Seafood Committee, Eugene was the project leader for the 2019 revision of the Cured, Salted, and Smoked Fish Establishments Guidance Document and created the AFTO Fish Evisceration video. In 2019, Eugene volunteered with Land O'Lakes International's Ventures 37 Farmer to Farmer program and as a seafood expert in Egypt. Eugene spent 2 weeks in Egypt providing guidance to seafood processing and dairy processing facilities across the Nile Delta. Eugene has been published in numerous times for articles related to food safety and seafood safety, is a certified fisheries professional with the American Fisheries Society, an AFTO SHA seafood HACCP trainer, seafood processing subject matter expert, and holds a USCG 100-ton master captain's license and is an avid fisherman. Welcome, Mr. Evans. The floor is yours.
Good afternoon, everybody. So today we're going to be talking about seafood pathogens of concern at retail. And what I would like to do is I would like to sort of preface this by saying that this is obviously a Zoom meeting, and obviously we don't have the ability to talk in person and meet afterwards. So I wanted to make this a presentation that could be used as reference material to look back upon if anybody needed any information in the future. So, okay, so I guess we can move to the next slide. All right, so obviously fish and fishery products, and that could be raw fish or anything made with fish, can host a wide variety of pathogens, toxins, spore-forming toxins, etc. Now, when we look at those, we're going to be looking at those as hazards. So now the hazards that we're going to be looking on are ones that are going to be controlled at the retail food environment. Okay, next slide. Okay, so one of the biggest pathogens of concern and hazards of concern at the retail environment obviously is Listeria. Now, Listeria pretty much grows everywhere. It can be found on food contact surfaces, packaging material, floor drains. I mean, it's very big in floor drains, but it's also been isolated off of 50-pound bags of sugar. Now, an interesting thing is that 62% of surface waters surface waters on fishing grounds in the United States are contaminated with Listeria monocytogenes. Okay, so when you look at your high-risk products, obviously you're looking at products that generally don't have a heat treatment. okay, for the most part. Now, those are the products that would naturally have a potential of containing that. Now, other products that would be cooked, then you'd be looking at a sanitation issue. So now Listeria is known to be a harborage pathogen that once it gets inside of a facility, it can be very difficult to get out, whether they're cracks, crevices, types of materials used to construct a facility, could be grout that gets loose and the pathogens can get inside there. Same thing with other pathogens as well, but Listeria is a very big issue. Okay, so next slide. Okay, so what we're going to look at, and a lot of these slides, I'm going to try to talk about various control strategies. So when I'm looking at Listeria and I'm looking at raw fish, let's just say I was, for instance, sushi. Okay, so if I'm going to purchase fish, or an establishment is going to purchase fish to create sushi, ideally they'd be purchasing that from one of their suppliers with a letter of guarantee indicating that it's raw and ready, it's raw, ready-to-eat product. Okay, and if there's, later on we're going to be discussing parasites, and they most likely would put the same letter of guarantee for parasites that it's been frozen or it's been fed a pelletized feed if it was an aquaculture species. So coming in, if you're purchasing a product from a supplier that has that, you have a level of assurance. Okay, the next issue you're going to have there is proper evisceration if the product isn't eviscerated. So ideally what you're going to want to do is make sure that you don't puncture any of the organs and release any of the stomach matter, digestive juices, etc. You want to fully rinse your stomach cavity to make sure you rinse anything out. Some things that you're finding at the retail level now, and this is something that over the last 10 years is not really becoming more commonplace, but you're seeing it a little more often than normal. You're getting surface pathogen elimination procedures. Okay, so you have establishments that are using various chemicals. Right now, we only have 3 in the United States that are allowed for use on seafood. One is acidified sodium chloride that will be found under 21 CFR 173.325. You're going to have ozone, which is 21 CFR 173.368. and peroxyacetic acid, which is 21 CFR 173.370. Those would be used as a dip, where they would dip the product, dip your fillets or your whole fish in the solution for a set period of time. Obviously, that would be validated, and then they would take it out. And the hope is that you're going to get a several log reduction of Listeria and other pathogens of public health significance. Okay, so now once we do that, I mean, if we do have levels of Listeria that aren't detectable, you still want to prevent them from growing to levels where they are detectable. So proper refrigeration is going to be essential. And obviously, as we discussed before, if you have a facility where Listeria could harbor, you want to make sure that your facility is built properly so you minimize those areas where harborage could take place. And then obviously you're going to want to have a good cleaning and sanitizing protocol in place to make sure that nothing grows and would harbor on the surface. Okay, next slide. Okay, so now one of the big issues that people talk about with fish is Salmonella. And it's not something that people normally look at. I mean, everybody seems to look at Salmonella as something that you would find in chicken or maybe beef or even some of your vegetables. But Salmonella can be found on seafood products. Okay, so now several years back, 7.4% of U.S. oysters tested positive for Salmonella. Now, in 2012, you had a big outbreak with ground tuna scrape. And that product had Salmonella Barilli and Salmonella Anchanga, and there were multiple illnesses throughout the United States. So when you see that kind of product, a tuna scrape, that is something that you want to take a closer look at. And hopefully, if on an inspection or if you have a facility and you're purchasing something like that from your supplier, it's a good idea to see if you can get some documentation indicating that that product was destined for ready-to-eat usage, because a lot of times you'll find the cheaper ones are generally used for maybe like a tuna burger or something that you would fully cook the product, and it wasn't intended for ready-to-eat use without a heat treatment. Okay, aquacultured seafood. I mean, you can't say that it's something that it's inherent to aquacultured seafood, but if an aquaculture facility doesn't have a good sanitation program, or the environment that they have the facility in has potential contaminants from other types of animals, or just the environment itself has a high risk of salmonella, you could find that product to be contaminated with salmonella. Now, that's not all aquaculture products. I mean, you have some really, really big aquaculture facilities throughout the world that really don't have these problems, but it's something that you want to take a look at in maybe an aquaculture facility or product coming from underdeveloped countries. Okay. Now, on a side note, any product, whether it's raw or ready to eat, if there's salmonella in it, it's considered adulterated. Okay. So now, looking at any of your pathogens, starting from the vessel, so properly harvesting the fish, putting it on a boat that's been properly cleaned and sanitized, transporting it, dockside offloading, and then when it gets to the retail facility, everything along the line has to have excellent sanitation. Okay, let's move to the next slide. Okay, so looking at control strategies, obviously, you can get a letter of guarantee indicating that it's pathogen-free. Again, you have proper visceration. This is basically going to be similar to what we were looking at controls for Listeria. Okay, so basically it's the same exact thing. You're going to, generally a good sanitation program is something that you're going to use, and making sure that you have a letter of guarantee. Generally for both of those pathogens, it's something that you'd be looking at. Okay, next slide. All right, Vibrio. So Vibrios are generally, we're looking at Vibrios in mollusk and shellfish, but with the rise of raw ready-to-eat products, sushi, poke, things of that nature, Vibrio is going to be a concern. So looking at this, I mean, this is something that source control is going to be a very big issue here, because you don't want to be harvesting this product out of polluted waterways. So looking at this, if I was looking at shellfish, obviously your state shellfish control authority, if you were in a state that harvested shellfish, you'd want to make sure, or they would want to make sure, that the products were harvested at a time frame and in an area that were considered unpolluted. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. Okay, so in raw mollusk and shellfish, obviously you're looking at your tags. Okay, so approved waters, licensed harvesters and dealers, temperature control. Obviously, you want to make sure you have proper temperature control. Now, you could be 40 degrees, it could be 45 degrees, it could be 41 degrees, depending on whichever state or local municipality that you're in. But in any case, good temperature control is going to help control the growth of Vibrio. Now, obviously, you can cook it. You could do HPP, or radiation, heat shocking. Now, individual quick freezing with extended frozen storage, that's something that can work. And obviously, if you're going to buy something, or if an establishment buys something like that, you want to see some sort of documentation indicating that that's what was used to destroy the Vibrio. Heat shocking is an interesting one. A lot of people really don't look at that as a method of controlling Vibrio, because it's a heat treatment that is sufficient enough to destroy Vibrio, but not other pathogens of public health significance. So it wouldn't be enough to destroy Salmonella or Listeria, or high numbers of them, but it is enough to destroy Vibrio, and it would maintain its raw characteristics. So it would look like a raw product. It wouldn't look like it was cooked at all, but you would have Vibrio destroyed. Okay, we can go to the next slide. All right, so now finfish and crustacean shellfish, obviously the same things. You could look for letters of guarantees. Obviously, for visceration is going to be useful. Surface path elimination procedures, and the same thing again as temperatures. Okay, so now one of the biggest control strategies obviously is going to be temperature. Temperature is a common theme that you're going to see throughout all of these, and that's something that to take a really close look at, is when you receive your product, when you're storing the product, and during processing. I mean, if in a retail environment, a lot of times the kitchen gets very hot and there's a lot of things going on, and you could have product sitting out for several hours while it's being processed, and that can pose a risk. All right, so now let's move on to histamines. Histamines is a very big issue. I mean, obviously, one of the bigger ones is tuna, but it's any species that generally will have high levels of the amino acid histidine, which could convert to histamines. Now, looking at histamine-forming species, what I would suggest that you do if people are uncertain as to whether or not your species is histamine-forming species is FDA has the Fish and Fishery Products Hazards and Controls Guidance document. That document is very useful. You can go to Chapter 3, and if you look up your species, you'll be able to identify your species. It's a good thing to get your genus and species name as well, because sometimes the common names are often mistaken, or they give the wrong one. So having a genus and species name really helps narrow it down. And then you could look and see if in there, if your product is a histamine-forming species, it'll identify that. Okay. So now looking at histamines, a lot of people think that histamines are going to be something that your body can't get rid of. Your body cannot fight them off. They can't degrade them. But low levels of histamines can be degraded by the body, by the small intestine. Now, you have other biogenic amines, which are similar to histamines. Now, putrescine, that comes from your amino acid ornithine, and cadaverine comes from your amino acid lysine. And the same way that histidine is converted to histamine is the same way that putrescine and cadaverine are formed as well. And that's through spoilage microorganisms that are present on the surface of the product with elevated temperatures, and growth will form, and the conversion factor will take place. So obviously you want to prevent the occurrence of all your biogenic amines. Okay, so not just putrescine and cadaverine, because if I do have low levels of histamine, that would not most likely cause a risk. If putrescine and cadaverine are present, they shut off the small intestine's ability to degrade it, and now you have a problem. Now you could have a reaction, and that's something that we want to totally prevent. All right, so obviously we're looking at our control strategies. 40 degrees Fahrenheit is going to be your control for histamines. Now, obviously food code is going to be 41, or depending on where you are, could be 45. But if you can, see that it comes in at 40 degrees Fahrenheit or less. Sometimes if the product is covered in ice, it makes it a little bit easier, because now really not looking at temperatures if the product is fully covered in ice. So that's going to help. Obviously, we're looking at evisceration the same way. Surface pathogen elimination. If somebody were to do something like that in their facility, it wouldn't necessarily be controlling histamines. It would be controlling the spoilage microorganisms present for creating the histamines. But if histamines are already formed, there's nothing that you're going to do to actually degrade them on the surface of the product. So obviously, again, we're looking at refrigeration. And if we were to fully cook the product to destroy those spoilage microorganisms before histamines were formed, obviously the only way we would have histamine formation in a product if it was recontaminated. And obviously that's something that you look at tuna salad, where you have cooked tuna in a can, which theoretically wouldn't have any histamines, but yet there's been histamine outbreaks with tuna salad, but it was the environment that the tuna salad was produced in had spoilage microorganisms that would form histamine, and then once they got into the tuna itself with temperature-reduced conditions, the histamines formed. All right, so now we're looking at Staphylococcus. So Staphylococcus aureus, to be specific. So it is present on raw product, but competitive microorganisms generally will inhibit the growth. But once I put salt on a product, or I put in a brine, now I start inhibiting the growth of the competing microorganisms, and now Staphylococcus can grow and create a toxin. And that's something that obviously we're going to be, looking to control. Hydrated batters. So if I'm in a retail establishment that might be using tempura batters or some other type of a batter for frying, just breading fish, but they might make a batter to fry it. Those are areas that you really want to take a look at, because if that batter is sitting out at ambient temperature for hours on end, you could have staph toxin form, which won't be cooked out once that product is fried. Okay, so now obviously a control strategy for this, if I'm drying it, depending on your retail food regulations, you might need a scheduled process, or you might need a variance. So at the very least, you would hopefully need a variance, and the variance theoretically should be done by a process authority or somebody with expert knowledge if I was looking to dry a product, because drying temperatures, you're looking at whether, how low am I getting the water activity during drying. So that's obviously something that you want to make sure is clearly documented in a variance or a scheduled process. Now, the same thing with brining. So if I'm going to brine a product, obviously, depending on what you're brining it for, I could be brining it for flavor, or I could be brining it for smoking or curing or something like that. Obviously, that needs to be done under 38 degrees Fahrenheit or less, because we're going to be looking to control another pathogen in a brine, which is Clostridium Botulinum. But being that we're looking at a brine, you want to control the most hazardous pathogen. So we're going to do it at 38 degrees. Now, let's look at our hydrated batters. Now, the batter temperature is going to be an issue, as we said before. So if that's sitting next to a deep fryer, that temperature could rise up pretty quickly. So if I'm at between 51 and 70, you have 12 hours before toxin formation can form. Now, that's when Staph aureus is the only pathogen. Okay. Now, once I get above 70, you have 3 hours before toxin formation could occur if Staphylococcus is your only pathogen of concern. Now, if I'm in some sort of a kitchen or a grill area somewhere, and I have oil that's in a deep fryer at 300-400 degrees, it's not going to take that long for a little bowl of batter sitting next to the grill or the deep fryer to heat up. So this is something that you really want to take a close look at, because these times and the hours here are cumulative. So if I was out for an hour today, and then I took it back out the next day, and I was out for, put it out for an hour tomorrow, and an hour the next day, or even if I had it out for an hour at a clip for over the course of one day, and I went back and forth for lunch or dinner, and then maybe depending on how long the place is open, you could have cumulative toxin formation, and you might not even realize it, because it might have been out for it's only an hour and I put it back in. It's only an hour and I put it back in. So these are things that you really want to take a close look at. And some of your ways of doing this, a lot of places, what they'll do is they'll say, okay, you'll put a little sticker on the bowl, and this was put out at, let's just say, noon, and I'm going to give myself use it within 2 hours or discard within 2 hours, and now I'm putting myself in a range where I won't have to worry about the toxin forming. So there are various strategies that could be used, but you just have to make sure that whatever is being done, it's being done correctly. Okay. So now let's move on to Clostridium botulinum. Now, Clostridium botulinum is one of the most deadliest pathogens on Earth. So looking at this, you have smoked fish, vac packed and air packed, cured fish, salted fish, dried fish, and your salted caviars. Okay. Now, vacuum packaged raw fish, and what you're seeing now at retail a little bit more is the vacuum packaged unsalted caviars. So that's something that you really want to take a look at, because retailers now, a lot of people don't really want to have that much salt in their diet, so they're getting vacuum packaged caviars that generally says keep frozen, and they're trying to thaw them out and sell them. And that's going to pose an issue. So these are things that you want to take a look at. Now, obviously, you have your soups and things of that nature. Okay, now, any seafood with any part under anaerobic conditions. So I could have, let's just say I had some sort of a fish chunks or something fried, and it was put in a bucket, and the oil settled to the bottom. Well, there might be air at the top of that, but once I have that layer of oil, what's underneath that now becomes anaerobic. So these are things that you really want to take a look at. Okay, we can move on to the next slide. So looking at Clostridium botulinum, you have two groups. Okay, now group one, that's the one that will create an odor when the toxin is formed. So looking at that, you have temperatures above 50 is when toxin will form. Now, if I have my controlling factors, obviously going to be pH of 4.6 or less, you could have a water activity of 0.935 or a water phase salt of 10. Now, you could use water activity alone, or you could use water phase salt alone when you're dealing with just salt. But if I were to add sugar to this mix, water phase salt, you might have, it might actually be okay, but your numbers can be a little bit off. So generally, when you have a sugar and a salt mixture, you're going to want to look at water activity as your more accurate number. Okay, so even though you have an odor that's emitted during toxin formation, you really don't want to get to that level, because if I had a little bit of odor, or if the product itself naturally has a pungent odor to it, depending on some seasonings or whatever the case may be, you might not see that odor right off the bat, or you might actually think it's just the natural flavor of the product, and somebody can put themselves at risk. So there are issues, and it's a big issue with the group ones, but the group twos are even more of an issue, because there's no indicator of toxin formation, because there's no odor exhibited. The product, if it was in a packaged product, it wouldn't be gassing off and blowing up. You're not going to have any of that. Now, that's where temperatures of 38 degrees Fahrenheit or less. So you're looking at your type E's, which is the marine strain, and your non-proteolytic B and F. So temperatures 38 or above, you want to keep everything 38 or less, and that's what we were talking about before with the brine. Okay, now this is controlled at a higher pH of 5. Okay, obviously a higher water phase salt of 5 and a water activity of 0.97. Now, as we talked about with salt and sugar, your water activity might be your better number, but another thing to take into consideration is that pH and water activity, or pH and water phase salt, can be used in combination for the control of both of these. It's just something that would have to be validated. So it's not like it's a sliding scale, because you have, depending on the product, it could be different. So that's something, if somebody was going to use something like that, you'd want to see a validated procedure. Okay. Now, this is something that you're going to see in a lot of your sushi places. So this is going to be aquacultured hamachi. Okay. And this is something that's going to be a real issue, because this is just raw fish in a vacuum package bag. The vacuum package bag itself is not considered a 10K bag, so it's not considered oxygen permeable. Okay, and on the next slide, you're going to see the control strategy of what you really need to see. Actually, 2 slides later. So number one, Clostridium botulinum spores are going to be present in the gills, and they're going to be present in the intestinal cavity. So proper evisceration, okay, is going to be essential. So now, as Laura said before, I worked on the fish evisceration video at AFDO, so we can give you the website and the area to find a fish evisceration video, so you could properly identify what proper fish evisceration looks like. Okay, brining under 38 degrees is going to be a control strategy. Now, if I'm smoking, you're looking at water phase salt. Is going to be an issue. Generally, you're looking at 3.5% water phase salt or 3% water phase salt for vacuum packaged products. And if it's hot smoked and cold smoked, there's 2 different temperatures that you're going to have to achieve in times at hot smoking temperatures. Now, water phase salt, water activity pH, or cured products, that's, let's just say you're looking at cured herring in oil, or salt cured salmon in oil, or something like that, or maybe a pickled herring. That's something that you'd be looking at pH. Those are some similar products that you'd be looking at for that. Now, when we're looking at anaerobic conditions, ideally, you're going to want temperature and another barrier. So you're looking at two barriers. So now if it's not shelf stable. If it's shelf stable, you're going to be all right with, let's just say if it had water activity of 0.83 or less, you're not going to have any growth. But if it's a refrigerated product, let's just say I had a pH of 5, obviously you want to make sure you have adequate refrigeration to get your second barrier. Now, as we talked about before, you have 10K bags. Those are breathable films. Now, what that's intended to do is allow the spoilage microorganisms that are present on the product to grow and outcompete Clostridium botulinum toxin formation. Where that can be a problem is if they use a surface pathogen elimination procedure, and that procedure destroyed a sufficient number of spoilage microorganisms that you no longer have control for Clostridium botulinum, that product can't be in that bag. Now, at retail, this is not something you're generally going to see at retail, but when a retailer purchases this product, it's something that they want to take a look at. Now, something that we see a lot now at the retail environment, especially bigger facilities that want to do some long-term storage, you're looking at cook chill. Now, cook chill, what you're looking at is a 6D lethality of non-proteolytic type B, which is your most heat-resistant form of your non-proteolytic CBOT. So most likely you're going to have to get a variance at retail to do this. And there is a chart. You can find it in a hazards guide. You can find it on the FDA website, USDA. I think the food code actually has it listed as well, where you're going to have your times, your internal temperatures, and the times that need to be held at those internal temperatures to achieve your 6D lethality. And that's something that you must do before it goes in that package. Okay, next slide. So now when you look back at the vacuum package Hamachi that we had, generally what you're going to need there, because you only have one barrier, that's refrigeration. So ideally what you're going to be looking at is, this is called a time temperature indicator. And this sticker is what you would see on the package. Now, right now, the only one that I know of, there might be others, but the only time temperature indicator that I know of that will match the Skinner-Larkin curve, which is the curve where you have toxin formation dependent on the time and temperature. For Clostridium botulinum toxin formation is the FITSAB L5-8 for seafood. Okay, now when you're looking at this, the green box, that shows you the percentages of time temperature abuse that took place, where the product had time temperature abuse but didn't have enough time temperature abuse to allow for toxin formation. Now, it doesn't mean that it didn't have enough time temperature abuse to allow for other pathogens of concern to grow. So if this is something that that's going to be served raw, you might have to look at those other hazards. But just looking at Clostridium botulinum, the green box would be colors within the TTI that would be considered acceptable for sale that are safe. Now, looking in the orange box to the left, when you see the inside of the circle is orange, and then when you look to the right, it's red. No way can you use that product for anything, because that product is going to be considered adulterated at that point. Okay, so these are things to look at when you see those TTIs. This is a means of interpreting what you're seeing on the TTI itself. Now, looking over to the right, if I see a white circle in that TTI, that means that TTI was not activated. So you have no idea what happened from a temperature control perspective inside that package. So that's something to take a closer look at as well. If the TTI was not activated, you don't know what happened there. So that's going to be, that could be a bigger problem. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. Okay, so parasites, everybody talks about parasites at sushi places and poke places. I mean, there's a lot of different species that contain parasites. As I said before, if you're unsure of whether or not the species that you're looking at is parasite containing, you could use the Fish and Fishery Products Hazards and Controls Guidance document to identify whether or not your species is a parasite containing species. Now, there's various different types of parasites. They're generally going to be controlled in two ways. Proper cooking. So proper cooking to 145 for 15 seconds, which is the minimum proper cooking temperature on the food code, will destroy parasites. Now, if you're not going to cook the product, or you're going to partially cook the product, okay, the product must be frozen at -4 degrees for 7 days. Actually, we could look at the next page for that one. But looking at this, now some of your more prevalent products that are going to be served raw, ceviche, cured herring is very big. Cold smoked fish, there's no heat treatment. Cold smoked fish generally is not going to go above 90 degrees Fahrenheit, so you're not going to destroy anything there. Now, poke drunken crabs. Drunken crabs is that's a dish where they heat up a liquid with wine and beer and other spices, and they just throw the crabs in, so the crabs the shell turns colors, and then take it out and they serve it. So you're really not getting a full lethality. And then you're looking at undercooked fish. Like, let's just say I have a grilled fish, and somebody wants that fish to be a little bit rare on the inside. You didn't destroy the parasites on that, so that's an issue of a parasite issue right there. All right, so let's go to the next slide. So as we talked about before, -4 degrees for 7 days, that's generally the one that you're going to see the most. Okay, and for most retailers that are going to look to freeze, that's probably what they're going to do. Okay, because most of the freezers that you get, unless they're a very, very expensive freezer, really aren't going to get below maybe -10 degrees Fahrenheit. Okay, so, but you do have -31 or below until solid, and then stored at -31 for 15 hours, and then -31, and then at -4 for 24 hours. So those are your general strategies that you have. If you have a facility that wants to use another strategy, maybe if they had super cold temperatures, like if they put it in liquid nitrogen, that would have to be validated with some sort of scientific documentation that it's effective. Unless they wanted to use one of the freezing regimes above. Okay, so let's go to the next one. So now this is a chance, if you're an inspector or if you're a retailer, to educate people in your facility. So Sushi Grade generally doesn't mean anything in terms of parasites or ready to eat or anything else like that. Sushi Grade just means it has a fat content that gives a good appearance, so it's just a quality issue. It has nothing to do with food safety. Now, looking at a lot of the sushi chefs out there, they say, oh, frozen fish, we don't want to freeze our fish to kill parasites because it tastes terrible. Well, there is some truth to that. And looking at that, you got to ask yourself why. Well, your critical freezing zone is 32 to 23 Fahrenheit. So if I take hours upon hours on end, and if I just threw this in a regular home freezer, and I had a big piece of fish, that might take, 8, 9, 10 hours to get down through that critical freezing zone. And then even longer to get down to -4 degrees Fahrenheit or less. So the longer the time I spend going from 32 to 23, I'm going to have larger ice crystals, which are more jagged. Okay, those ice crystals in that jagged form have the potential of puncturing the cell membranes. And now when you're looking at those ice crystals forming, the fresh water in solution is going to freeze first. So now you're going to have your concentrated minerals, which would freeze at a lower temperature. Those concentrated minerals are corrosive. So they're going to have the potential of eroding the cell membranes and destroying those as well. So there's two reasons why. One, you want to make small ice crystals, okay, that are tightly packed together, and you want to make sure that you minimize the time that those concentrated salt and minerals can degrade the cell membranes. Okay, let's go to the next slide. All right, so now looking at that, let's just if you want to give somebody an example of what we're talking about, let's go back. Let's just say I took a bag of lentils and I tossed that bag of lentils back and forth across the room. We could throw that all day long. But if I took that same bag and I put gravel in it and I threw that gravel back and forth across the room, it wouldn't take long for that gravel to break. Okay, so that's a good way of educating people with that. Now, we're looking at slow freezing. That's what we talked about before. That's when it takes forever to get into down to freezing temperatures. Now, quick or fast freezing, that's what you're going to find most common. So generally looking at 2 hours or less to get through the freezing zone. Blast chillers, that's what a lot of, that's what you're going to see at a bigger facility. That's what you want to use. Okay, the ultra rapid freezing liquid nitrogen, that's very, very rare. In my career, I've only heard of one place that was actually doing it, and they had customers that had lots of money, so that's why it was being done. But at retail, you're really not going to see plate freezers and blast tunnels, but the suppliers that are supplying that at the wholesale level will generally have that. But at the retail level, it's going to be moderately rare. So, looking at that, a lot of times it's gonna be beneficial to the retailer that if they want to make a product that has parasites and it needs to be frozen, it might be better off to have somebody else to freeze that product for them that has the capacity to do it quickly. It'd be much better. Okay, so now I think we're moving on here with time. So all right, so I guess the next slide we have, what are we looking at? Okay, we have all right, we have a little bit of time left. Okay, so here we have all our references and everything I referenced to put this together. I'm trying to just keep an eye on the time here. Okay, so now we're going to move on to questions, and I'm going to see if we can look at the questions here. I don't know if I have the ability to do that. Okay, so the references for the salmonella and the oysters, that's going to be in the references here. Okay. Okay, so now we're going to talk about that. Now, what about some of the other questions? Any other questions? I'm trying to see here.
Certainly. So thank you so much, Eugene. This was a really great presentation, and we're certainly happy to have so much information. We will be sure to share these slides and the other resources that you mentioned. After the conclusion of this webinar, you mentioned the evisceration video, so we'll make sure to provide that to our listeners. At this time, we would like to take some questions. So if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A box. Oops. And we will answer as many questions as we can.
All right, Laura, I'm going to try to jump through with some questions and answer some questions. So we have a question here about the tuna recontamination. So if the tuna in the tuna salad is fully cooked and had no histamine problem when preparing the salad, would histamines be able to form in the fully cooked, ready-to-eat tuna salad? So here's where this becomes an issue. So if I have tuna that was canned, there was no histamines in the can, and it was temperature controlled properly, but the surface that it was produced on, let's just say the bowls were dirty or the spoons or whatever was used to mix that salad, had histamine forming bacteria, and then the product was temperature abused, that's where we're going to run the risk of histamine formation, because we killed off, not only we killed off all competing microorganisms in that tuna salad. So now it depends on what the ingredients are. If I'm going to mix that in a mayonnaise-based tuna salad, I might have water activity, and I might have pH in the mayonnaise that might actually be slowing that down. So it might take an extended period of time of temperature abuse to actually have histamine formation. But if I had a tuna salad that, let's just say it was some chopped up tuna with some vegetables and maybe oil or some other type of dressing, that might not be the case, and I might have a more rapid growth or development of histamines during temperature abuse conditions.
Great,
Okay,
thank you. Let's see, we do have another question here. Could you tell us why would a TID not get activated?
All right, so they would not get activated. Some of them have to be actually pressed So yeah, some time temperature indicators, if you press them, then they'll activate. So that's where the issue would come in with that. And some of them can just be defective. So let's just say if it was damaged or it was stepped on or dropped or whatever the case may be when before it was put on a package.
Great, thank you. Another question is it safe to assume that all fish supplied to a sushi restaurant is previously frozen to control for parasites?
Actually, that's no. It's not safe to assume that, and a lot of the sushi I mean, I've done many inspections at sushi suppliers, and you'll see some of their customer list, and they'll say, well, this is product that's going to be sold to be cooked by end user, but then some of their customers are high-end sushi restaurants, and then the same thing at retail. Where you're going to find that a supplier would supply product, and some of them will actually give you documentation that the product hasn't been controlled, it needs to be cooked by end user. So if that's the case, there's been no parasite control. So that's why, I mean, if it's a parasite-containing species, you're going to need documentation from your supplier that parasites were controlled.
Great, thank you. And we do have a couple of questions about 10K OTR oxygen transmission rate bags. One question is, have you observed any food safety issues with 10K bag usage with fresh fish?
With fresh fish, I mean, the only issue with fresh fish, and from just looking at this from a Clostridium botulinum perspective, the 10K bag is going to allow spoilage microorganisms to grow. So I've seen them a few times, and there were no issues from them. They'll say 10K across the bag. Some of the ones that you're seeing now, which are a little more prevalent, are the tilapia fillets coming in. So that's something that in New York I've seen, but I haven't had any problems with it. But now, looking at that question, is one or two types that might not be acceptable. The bag itself should say 10K, so a bag that's not acceptable, I would say that's a bag that was labeled, that wasn't intended to be used as an oxygen permeable bag. Or if it was a bag that's oxygen permeable, but might not have the oxygen permeability needed to control Clostridium botulinum toxin formation. So there are different oxygen permeability rates on those bags, and generally at retail, you really don't see retailers doing that. That normally comes from wholesale suppliers. But if there's a retailer that's out there that's going to be using the oxygen permeable film, I would suggest that they get documentation from their supplier that this product is 10K. Make sure they have all the documentation indicating that this is exactly what it is that they're getting.
Okay. We have a question about ciguatera. Do you have any comments to help explain ciguatera to retail operators? And can you give us some background on that?
Okay, so ciguatera, you're going to see that a lot of the fish coming from, some of it from the Gulf, from the dry Tortuga banks. There will be some product from the Pacific. Now, once that forms, okay, and it's very difficult to determine whether or not this product has ciguatera in it or not. Now, the species, it's at the retail level, let's just say. At a wholesale level, there's a lot more ability to control that. But at the retail level, there really isn't much you're going to do unless you buy that because you're going to be buying it from a supplier that, in theory, should be following seafood HACCP. Now, where you might find that to be a problem at retail is if you have a species that's known to be a ciguatera hazard species, and a restaurant might have a relationship with a commercial fisherman, and he might buy it directly from the commercial fisherman or a local fisherman. Now, if that local fisherman didn't harvest that fish in an area that is free or has a minimal risk of ciguatera, now that restaurant is going to run the risk of having a species with ciguatera, but there's really not much you're going to do and at the restaurant level or retail level for cooking out or freezing it or having any sort of control for that. I mean, that's going to be a source control issue, definitely.
Great, thank you. We have several questions about thawing of reduced oxygen packaged seafood. So there are two similar questions. The first is, when thawing frozen ROP seafood, do you need to fully remove it from the packaging prior to thawing, or is it okay to just slit the package? And the second is, would a cake tester being poked through the package be sufficient to protect from from Clostridium botulinum? That's a very specific, but can you talk a little bit about the packaging and how to prevent CBOT?
Okay, so if I'm thawing a frozen ROP product, okay, obviously it's going to depend. Now, if that product was cooked to destroy non-proteolytic type B, okay, we're not going to have the non-proteolytic CBOT hazard present. So general refrigeration would control below 50 degrees is going to control proteolytic growth. So that product can be defrosted in the package, okay, and that's not going to be a problem. But let's just say I have a product, let's just say I had cooked lobster, and that cooked lobster was frozen, but it was only cooked for a 6D lethality of Listeria. I've now killed off my spoilage microorganisms, and I have no control for Clostridium botulinum at that point. So, I mean, if I was going to defrost, I mean, if you look at the packaging, a lot of the packaging, there's a general statement in a hazards guide that suggested that, keep frozen, thaw in the refrigeration immediately before use. So if there was a procedure at retail where it was a small package, they ran it under the sink for 10, 15 minutes, it thawed, and they cut it open and they threw it into a dish, it might not be a concern. But if I have a 20-pound, 30-pound vacuum package bag of, let's just say, cooked lobster meat, and if that's something that it's going to be very difficult to throw into a sink and try to defrost. So that might sit in the refrigerator for several days to properly defrost. That could be a problem because if it sits there and you have problems with your refrigerator, and especially at the retail environment, you're not really required to have continuous monitoring. So you really don't know if something happened overnight. Generally, I would suggest cutting the bag on a product like that and definitely allowing air into the package. So now let's jump right into the cake tester question. I might have a package that might contain an oil or something in it. So I might put a cake tester and poke the top of the bag. But the bottom of the bag, let's just say if it was something sitting in a bucket or something like that, what's underneath can still be anaerobic. So you might want to have a little bit more air, or it depends. I mean, you just have to look at it, rationally and see. I mean, if it's something in oil, or if it's something in sort of a thick liquid, or something tightly pressed, then you might have a real issue. But generally, I mean, I look to encourage people at all costs. If it was something that wasn't cooked for the destruction of non-proteolytic CBOT, or doesn't have pH control or water activity control, the water phase salt, I generally encourage people to cut the bag right away and just make it a little bit easier for yourself.
Thank you. We have a question about in canning of tuna or other species.
Okay.
Does brining for flavor still increase the risk of botulism, even though a pressure cooker will be used to assure sufficient temperature is attained?
Okay, so if I'm going to brine a product, okay, now the retort procedure, now that's going to be LACF, so that's not something that you would generally, I mean, if you, let me just preface that, if it's going to be lightly salted for flavor and salt and water activity is not going to be a control. If it's just something that with a very high water activity in it, it would generally something that would fall under LACF guidance. Your brining for flavor isn't really going to do much, and if you did create toxin, let's just say if it was temperature abused or whatever, now your retort procedure not only would have to destroy your spores that are present, but you'd have to destroy the toxin that's there. Now, toxin can be destroyed, but ideally you don't want to be creating toxin before you do anything with a product. So, I mean, that's generally not a good manufacturing practice to do something like that. But it's something that can easily be controlled with temperature, depending on how long the brining took place. If the brining was, a half hour or something like that, and then it went into a procedure, it might not be an issue. But if it's something over the course of many hours or days, then you have an issue.
Can you say a little bit about the elements of a parasite destruction letter that you would look for to deem it acceptable?
Okay, so now food code there's really not much in the food code, and many of your retail regulations out there aren't really specific. But ideally, something that you would want to see or hope to see that would make it believable, or something that would at least stand up in a hearing or in court. Now, obviously, you're going to want to make sure that the supplier puts their name and address on the form. I would like to see something that's current, so generally something that was, dated and signed within like the last year. And more often than not, what you're going to see from some of these companies is they'll list the freezing regime that they use, whether it's -4 for 7 days or -31 until solid, or whatever the case may be. They'll list that as a primary strategy for parasite control. Now, another means of parasite control is if that product was raised in an aquaculture environment and it's a parasite-containing species. You might see documentation indicating that the product was fed a pelletized feed, and the pelletized feed was cooked to destroy any viable parasites, and subsequently the parasite issue isn't going to be something that would be a concern. But that's something that you're going to want to closely look at.
Thank you. It looks like we have just time for about one more question. So the last question I have on the board for you today, Mr. Evans, is what is the concern with tuna scrape?
Okay, so tuna scrape, looking at that is generally going to be the meat that is left close to the bone when a tuna is loined. And a lot of times you'll see that they scraped it off with a spoon. Like you see like a smaller tuna in some of the videos, they'll scrape it off with a spoon and they'll put it on the side. So that's something that obviously is going to be close to your abdominal cavity. It's going to be something that has a lot of manual handling. It's going to be something that, because it's very close to the bone, it's the racks, or I should say that the skeletons are going to be put to the side, and that might be something that's done later on because the most profitable portion of the tuna is going to be the loins and not the tuna scrape. So looking at that, now you have multiple issues of racks of tuna just potentially being sat on the side or put in an environment or maybe scraped off later, and then you have to handle it. Did the person adequately wash their hands? And was the equipment that they used sanitary, and then it was put in a bowl? And basically it's sort of in a situation where you're looking at that as ground beef. So anything that was on the outside is now ground through to the inside, because some of that tuna scrape, it could be ground up depending on how thin the layer is that's attached to the bones. It could be scraped off and just thrown into a bowl. It might be mashed up later on. So it all depends. But I look at that as basically like ground beef.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Mr. Evans. Thank you for sharing such valuable information with us. We'll be sure to share the slides and the resources you mentioned at the conclusion of the webinar. And so we are nearing the end of our time today. We do hope you will join us on our next webinar in the Pathogen series, which will be next Tuesday. We'll hear from Dr. Inez Ortega on Cyclospora. So Mr. Evans, we sincerely thank you for your time, your valuable insights on today's webinar, and we thank all the attendees for their time and participation and dedication to food safety. Please be well.
And I'll try to get those questions answered as soon as possible and get them back to everybody.
Thank you very much. Hope you all have a great day.
Have a great day, everyone. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.